Imagine a woman who owned entire provinces, yet whose most prized possession was something money could never buy: her freedom. The story of Stefania Radziwill is no fairy tale about a princess drowning in luxury. It is the chronicle of a desperate struggle for the right to be oneself, when viewed as the most valuable prize in an auction of destinies, orchestrated by a great empire. Fortunes were laid at her feet, along with the passionate hearts of St. Petersburg's most eligible bachelors. Even now, in a room fragrant with 1,000 roses, lay not merely a gift, but a declaration from Prince Yusupov himself, an offer of his hand, his heart, and all that he possessed. Any other woman in her position would have considered it the pinnacle of her dreams. But not her. She read the letter, her gaze drifting across the petal-strewn room. It was beautiful, dazzling even. But her heart, that treacherous tuning fork of the soul, remained stubbornly silent. With a heavy sigh, her hand reached for a quill. Refusal was always unpleasant, but breaking one's own life for the sake of another's whim was a far sadder fate. Her reply was polite, yet firm as steel beneath a velvet glove. She could not accept the prince's heart, nor his roses. Such was Princess Stefania Radziwill, a name whispered in high society with bated breath, a mixture of envy, admiration, and reverential fear. Just consider, her fortune was comparable to the budget of a small European nation. She owned lands that today would encompass entire regions, nearly 1,000,000 hectares of forests, fields, and villages, palaces brimming with artistic treasures, and caskets overflowing with family jewels. But as is so often the case, this immense wealth became her golden cage. For the young Polish aristocrat, heiress to an ancient line, was not merely a wealthy bride. She had become a strategic asset of the Russian Empire, a piece on the grand chessboard of politics, where her hand, her fortune, and her future were stakes in a game played by others. How would a girl who inherited a fairy tale treasure fight for the simple human right to love and be free? And what price would she have to pay for that fight? So, where did this colossal inheritance come from? This golden weight on the young princess's legs? To understand, we must delve into the history of her family, a story filled with passion and reckless decisions. The roots of her wealth and her drama lie in the tumultuous life of her father, Prince Dominik Hieronym Radziwill. He was a man who lived not by rules, but by the dictates of his heart, and those dictates led him too far. His entire life was a series of scandals that shook high society and ultimately sealed his daughter's fate. Dominik's greatest passion was Teofila Morawska, one of the most dazzling beauties of her era. There was just one problem. Teofila was married, which by the standards of the time made their connection utterly impermissible. The prince's guardian, tasked with preserving the ancient family's reputation, was furious. To avert disaster and rein in the ardent heir, he was hastily married off to the noble Isabella Mnisek. This union, born of calculation, proved to be childless, cold, and miserable, collapsing after only 2 years. By then, Teofila Morawska had also managed to free herself from the bonds of her own unhappy marriage. In 1809, the lovers were finally able to wed. However, by that point, their son Alexander was already growing up, having been born 2 years before their official union. Shortly after the wedding, their daughter Stefania was born in Paris. This seemingly minor nuance in the timeline proved to be fateful. It created the perfect legal trap that would make Stefania fabulously wealthy. Tragedy struck in 1813. Prince Dominic, just 27 years old, met his end, and immediately the question of inheritance arose. According to the laws of the Russian Empire, under whose jurisdiction a significant portion of the Radziwill estates fell, illegitimate children had no right to titles or fortunes. Alexander, despite being the firstborn son, found himself legally a nobody, and so the entire vast estate, all the lands and treasures, went to the sole legitimate heir, little Stefania. But why were Polish treasures being judged by Russian law? Here, high politics and another of her father's rash actions came into play. Captivated by the glory of Napoleon Bonaparte, Prince Dominic had joined his army, thereby committing a direct act of treason against the Russian Emperor, Alexander I. As punishment, the Russian throne placed his properties under sequestration, officially on the pretext of unpaid debts. Thus, through the passions, mistakes, and political gambles of her father, Stefania instantly became the wealthiest heiress in Europe, and simultaneously a hostage in her new homeland. Her childhood in the magnificent Nesviz castle was cut short, and a very different life awaited her within the golden cage of the Imperial court. And so, young Stefania's fate was sealed. The vast fortune she inherited from her father's turbulent life had now turned her into the most prized trophy of the Russian crown. Her childhood in the ancient Nesviz castle, spent among family portraits and legends, came to an abrupt end. A new chapter awaited her, one written not for her, but for the interests of an entire empire. She moved to St. Petersburg, and her new home became the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, the most prestigious educational institution in the country. But one should not be deceived by its noble name. For Stefania, this was no mere school. It was a gilded cage where her every step, word, and sigh was monitored with intense scrutiny. The chief warden of this cage was none other than the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna herself. A woman of iron will, clad in lace and velvet, she happened to be a distant cousin to Stefania's grandmother. This remote family tie became a convenient and respectable pretext for taking the orphan under her personal, unceasing guardianship. In reality, it was not care, but total control. The Imperial family understood perfectly what a jackpot had fallen into their hands. A young, beautiful, and incredibly wealthy heiress who could be profitably married off to the right man, thereby strengthening political alliances and keeping her colossal capital within the empire. Stefania was not a ward, she was a living state asset. When the girl turned 17 and it was time to leave the institute, a true drama unfolded. Her own mother, the very same Teofila Morawska, arrived in St. Petersburg to finally take her daughter home. Imagine the scene. A woman whose scandalous reputation for numerous husbands and a tumultuous youth was known throughout high society, trying to assert her maternal rights in the face of the all-powerful imperial family. She stood no chance. The court was adamant. To release such a valuable prize into the hands of a woman with such a dubious past, never. The wife of the English envoy, Lady Disbrow, watched the conflict with cold curiosity and recorded in her diary, Having heard much before of Princess Radzawill's beauty, I was greatly disappointed. Her mother has come to claim her daughter, but, according to rumor, the old Empress does not intend to give her daughter into such bad hands and means to keep her about her own person. Meanwhile, the legal battles over the inheritance raged on. The Polish aristocracy and distant relatives never ceased their attempts to challenge Stefania's rights. In the end, the emperor made a truly Solomonic decision, one, however, that served only his own interests. The ancestral Nesvies castle and its adjoining lands were transferred to representatives of the Prussian branch of the Radzawills, which pacified some of the dissenters. But Stefania was allowed to keep the far more extensive and profitable estates. It was a cunning political move. While formally demonstrating fairness, the crown retained control over the bulk of the wealth. Thus, by the time of her debut into society, Stefania was not just an eligible bride. She was a jewel in the imperial casket, and her future was plotted out many moves in advance. Her wealth had become her curse, and the imperial court a prison with the world's most exquisite bars. And now, her primary task would be to find someone who could help her escape it. Stepping out from the walls of the Smolny Institute, Stefania Radziwill walked directly into the epicenter of St. Petersburg society. And that society, dazzling and cold, immediately converged upon her. Picture the scene: a young woman of almost ethereal beauty, backed by a fortune that could overshadow the treasury of a minor European kingdom. She was not merely a debutante, she was the season's ultimate prize, the most coveted match whispered about in every salon, from the Anichkov Palace to the mansions on the English embankment. A swarm of suitors instantly gathered around her, drawn to her wealth and beauty like moths to a flame. But did any of them see behind that blinding radiance a living, trembling soul? The imperial court, of course, had its own very specific plans for her. The first official contender for her hand was her distant relative, Prince Ferdinand Radziwill. This union was a brilliantly conceived move by the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna. The marriage would reunite the scattered branches of the great house and, most importantly, keep all the wealth under reliable control by linking it to the Prussian royal family, as Ferdinand's father was married to a Prussian princess. Everything was decided, calculated, and approved at the highest level. Only one thing had not been consulted: the opinion of Stefania herself. And she, to the horror of her lofty patrons, showed not the slightest enthusiasm. The thought of a calculated marriage, a union where her feelings played no part, was unbearable to her. She resisted silently, seeing in this plan yet another attempt to lock her in a cage, albeit the most magnificent one in the world. And then fate, which sometimes displays the darkest sense of humor, intervened. In 1827, Prince Ferdinand, young and full of hope, passed away suddenly. For the court, it was an unfortunate setback, a carefully constructed house of cards tumbling down. But for Stefania, contemporaries who observed her noted that upon learning of the tragedy, she breathed a sigh of undeniable relief. This should not be seen as cruelty or heartlessness. It was the sigh of a person from whose shoulders an unbearable weight had just been lifted. It was a breath of freedom from an imposed destiny, even if that freedom was bought with another's life. She had been granted another reprieve, precious time to try and find her own path. But the hunt for her only intensified. Now that the dynastic plan had failed, dozens of other aristocrats entered the game, each dreaming of acquiring this incredible prize. Among them was an almost tragicomic figure, the crooked Prince Lvov, as he was mercilessly known in society. He was unattractive, with a physical deformity, but he was truly, madly captivated by Stefania's beauty. His courtship was ardent, almost desperate. But Stefania, who sought a kinship of souls, not blind adoration, refused him as well. She could not return his feelings, and her noble nature would not allow her to give false hope. This rejection proved fatal for the unfortunate prince. According to the lady-in-waiting Smirnova Rossett, he literally fell into consumption, broken by unrequited love. He went to distant Livorno for treatment, where his story soon came to an end. Thus, without ever intending it, Stefania was becoming a femme fatale, whose beauty and unattainability brought suffering to others. Seeing that matters had been left to chance and could lead to unpredictable consequences, Maria Feodorovna decided on a more subtle approach. She proposed a new, far more appealing candidate, Prince Lev Petrovich Wittgenstein. He was the son of a celebrated field marshal, a hero of the War of 1812, a man with an impeccable reputation and a heroic aura. And importantly, his family was also in some disfavor with the new emperor, Nicholas I, due to relatives' involvement in the Decembrist revolt. Perhaps it was this circumstance, this shadow of disgrace, that brought them together. For the first time, Stefania saw before her not a fortune hunter, but a man who, like her, knew what it was to be not entirely free. And for the first time, her heart responded. She liked Lev. Yet, even feeling this attraction, she was in no hurry to surrender. She continued to flirt with other suitors, turning heads, giving and taking away hope. This was not frivolity. It was a final, desperate attempt to assert her right to choose. She was testing her own feelings, comparing, weighing, to ensure that her decision was truly her own and not just another of the Empress's clever schemes. For her goal remained unchanged, as fixed as the North Star in the night sky. She was not looking for a wealthy husband. There was no one wealthier than her in the empire. She was searching for someone dear to her heart, someone who would see past the millions of hectares and the sparkle of diamonds to the woman who dreamed of simple human happiness. Finally, a glimmer of light appeared in the tangled labyrinth of court intrigues and heartfelt torments. In April 1828, in the glittering incense-filled chapel of the Winter Palace, Stefania Radziwill walked down the aisle to marry Lev Wittgenstein. It was a wedding that all of St. Petersburg watched with bated breath. The richest bride in the empire had found a husband. It seemed a triumph, the culmination of her long journey to personal happiness. Presiding as the bride's honorary mother was the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna herself, as if placing her personal seal of approval on the union. She sat, majestic and inscrutable, blessing the marriage she herself had arranged. But in this solemn, almost idyllic picture, there was one gaping void, one deafening silence that spoke louder than any congratulatory speech. The emperor was absent. Nicholas I, autocrat of all the Russias, sent a clear and cold signal with his non-appearance. He did not honor the couple with his presence, and the reason was known to everyone in the hall. His anger at the Wittgenstein family for their connection to the Decembrists. The revolt on Senate Square was an unhealing wound for Nicholas, a perpetual reminder of aristocratic betrayal. And though there was no direct evidence against Lev himself, the shadow of disfavor had fallen upon his entire family. Thus, on the happiest day of her life, Stefania gained not only a husband, but also the status of a wife to a man in the sovereign's disgrace. It was a ghost, invisibly present at their celebration, the ghost of imperial wrath that would haunt them for the rest of their short life together. The newlyweds settled in the luxurious Guriev mansion on the Fontanka River, and their home quickly became a center of high society. They were young, beautiful, fabulously wealthy, and it seemed genuinely happy. Stefania continued to charm everyone she met, even Alexander Pushkin, that discerning connoisseur of female beauty, could not resist her charms, and after meeting her at a ball, immortalized her in a poem as the Warsaw Countess. The diarist Dolly de Fickelmont, known for her sharp tongue, wrote of Stefania with undisguised admiration. Tall, slender, with fine and delicate features, the complete absence of pretension graces Countess Wittgenstein and lends her a true charm. She is the personification of purity of soul and happiness. But behind this brilliant facade of social life hid another Stefania, the one who waged her own quiet but persistent rebellion against the world that tried to consume her. This was not the kind of revolution that thunders in public squares, but a revolution of personal choice that took place within the walls of her own home. The wealthiest woman in the empire, who could afford the most exquisite delicacies from around the world, preferred simple, almost peasant-like food. The lady-in-waiting Smirnova Rosset noted with astonishment that while a French chef cooked for the guests, the hostess herself was served shchi or borscht, fried potatoes with onions, and simple fried eggs. What was this? The whim of a spoiled aristocrat? Number. It was a conscious act. It was her way of preventing gold and luxury from corroding her soul, a way to remain real, grounded, to maintain a connection with something simple and genuine in a world of artifice and etiquette. Her rebellion also manifested in her attitude toward people. In an era when servants were considered little more than inanimate objects, Stefania showed them astonishing kindness and care. She didn't just help the poor by giving alms. Many did that for the sake of reputation. She cared for her elderly servants, paying for them to live in boarding houses, ensuring them a dignified old age. Imagine what that meant at the time. It was a challenge to the entire class system, a quiet but powerful humanistic manifesto. She saw people not for their rank or position, but for their human essence. Her husband, Lev, supported her completely. He took upon himself all the tiresome business of managing her colossal inheritance, freeing her for the life she wanted to lead. However, the clouds above their heads were gathering. They were increasingly and insistently made to understand that their presence at court was unwelcome. It was better for them not to cross the emperor's path, whose cold gaze could freeze the warmest smile. This open disfavor wounded Stefania deeply. She, who had grown up under the guardianship of the Imperial family, now found herself in the position of an outcast. Resentment toward Nicholas I grew, and in her soul it mingled with another, deeper feeling, a sense of national pride. She was always surrounded by her compatriots, the Poles, for whom the Russian emperor was not just a monarch, but a symbol of their homeland's oppression. Yielding to their persuasions and listening to the voice of her own blood, Stefania transformed from a silent sufferer into an open opponent of the Russian emperor. Her quiet rebellion had taken on a political dimension. She had found a cause to fight for, and it gave her fragile form a new, unbending strength. But she did not yet know that fate had entirely different and far more tragic plans for her. Happiness, as we know, is a fragile thing. It is like the finest bohemian crystal. It shines in the sun, delights the eye, but a single ill-fated blow, and it shatters into 1,000 pieces. For Stefania and Lev, just such a crystalline period had arrived. Their home was filled with love and soon with the laughter of children. First, a daughter was born, whom they named Marie. Then, in search of a milder climate and to escape the cold breath of St. Petersburg's disfavor, the family moved to sunny Florence. Here, under the warm Italian sky, in 1832, Stefania gave her husband a long-awaited heir, a son, Peter. It seemed to be the pinnacle of a woman's destiny, a life full to the brim, a beloved husband, children, wealth, beauty. What more could one desire? But have you ever heard how quietly, on tiptoe, misfortune can enter the happiest of homes? It does not knock on the door or sound an alarm. It seeps in like a damp fog, like an autumn chill, and you only notice it when an incurable cold has already settled in your chest. This is precisely what happened to Stefania. Her fragile constitution, that delicate body which seemed made for ball gowns and light dances, could not withstand the double burden of motherhood. Immediately after the birth of her son, her strength began to fade rapidly. The doctors, whom a frantic Lev immediately summoned, delivered a verdict that in the 19th century sounded like an epitaph: consumption. It was the most fashionable, the most poetic, and the most merciless malady of the era. It did not disfigure. On the contrary, it seemed to accentuate the fragile beauty of its victims, giving their cheeks an unhealthy, feverish blush, and their eyes an unnatural, tragic brilliance. This quiet, ruthless thief slowly stole breath, strength, and life, leaving behind only a beautiful, fading shell. For Lev Wittgenstein, a descendant of warriors accustomed to facing the enemy head-on, this was the most terrifying battle. His enemy was invisible, dwelling inside his beloved wife, and against it, both sabers and fortunes of millions were powerless. He abandoned everything. He forgot about balls, politics, and social duties. His sole purpose became saving Stefania. He took her to the famous German spa town of Bad Ems, where all of European aristocracy gathered in a last hope of cheating fate. Imagine the atmosphere: healing waters, music in the parks, society strolls, and behind it all, a quiet, desperate fear. Lev surrounded his wife with incredible care, anticipating her every wish, but the disease was relentless. It progressed, stealing a piece of Stefania's life with each passing day. She was melting away like a wax candle, like snow under the first rays of the spring sun. Her life, which had only just begun to blossom, was already nearing its twilight. And then came that day in July 1832, her last day. She knew it, perhaps with the same supernatural intuition that allowed her to sense falsehood in others' hearts. She sensed the approach of her own end. In the morning, She asked for a light, airy pink dress. Not mournful black, not clinical white, but pink, the color of dawn, of youth, of life itself. It was her final, silent challenge to fate. Then she turned to her husband with a simple, almost childlike request to prepare her a gogol mogul, a sweet comfort food from her distant, carefree childhood. It was her last attempt to grasp the taste of life, to feel it on her lips. When everything was ready, she did not lie down in bed as one expects of a dying person. She sat in a chair, upright, with regal posture, as if receiving her last, most important guest. Lev stood beside her, clutching the cup, unable to utter a word, watching his world crumble before his eyes. She took a few sips, and then she simply bowed her head to her chest and fell still. No sigh, no groan, silence. She was frozen like a beautiful ancient sculpture, a marble statue in which a warm, living heart had just been beating. In that second, her heart stopped forever. The story of the richest woman in Europe, who had fought for freedom and love, was over. She was only 22 years old. Her passing was not a quiet fading. It was a deafening explosion of silence that shattered one man's world into before and after. Lev Wittgenstein was not just grief-stricken. He was erased, annihilated by it. For him, a man whose life had revolved around this fragile yet so strong woman, her absence became a black hole that consumed all color, sound, and meaning. The happiness he had sought for so long and held for so short a time had turned to ash, and in this desolate world, he had only one task left: to prevent her image from dissolving in time, from becoming a mere line in a genealogical tree. He had to make stone remember what fate had taken from him. The first thing he did was open her will. And even in this final document, she remained true to herself. It was not merely the distribution of colossal wealth, but a final act of her love and justice. She left her entire considerable fortune to her beloved husband and their small children, Marie and Peter. But there was another detail that stunned her contemporaries. A significant portion was bequeathed to her servants. Think of it. In an age when people of her class took service for granted, she remembered them to her last breath, securing their future. It was the final stroke in her portrait, the portrait of a woman with a truly royal soul. But that was not enough. Lev wanted to erect a monument to their love, one as eternal as his grief. He turned to the greatest painter of the era, Karl Briullov, the genius who had just shaken the world with The Last Day of Pompeii. But the prince commissioned not a painting, but something more: the design for a chapel mausoleum. Briullov, a master of drama and light, created a design suffused with sorrowful and majestic beauty. In 1834, on the Wittgenstein estate, this temple of memory was erected and, of course, named in honor of Saint Stephania. Thus, her name was immortalized in stone, becoming a symbol not only of sanctity, but of a tragic, interrupted love. Yet, human rumor is not satisfied with stone and prayers. The sudden and early departure of such a bright star could not fail to spawn whispers, rumors, and legends. The rational explanation, consumption, seemed too simple, too mundane for such an extraordinary destiny. And so, from the dark depths of ancestral memory, an old, blood-chilling legend surfaced. Smirnova Rossett claimed, whether retelling Stefania's own words or adding a touch of mystical flair, that the princess had known of her imminent end in advance. Allegedly, shortly before the tragedy, she had seen the Black Lady. According to the grim legend of the Radziwill family, this ghostly female figure in mourning clothes had roamed the corridors of Nesvi's castle for centuries, and her appearance always meant one thing: she came to warn a family member of their impending passage into the next world. But there were other, far more earthly and sinister rumors. It was whispered that the culprit in this drama was not mysticism, but human greed. A theory circulated that Stefania might have been slowly and systematically poisoned by the manager of the Wittgenstein estate. The motive? It was obvious. After her death, control over the vast fortunes would pass to other hands, and there is always good fishing in troubled waters. This version remained an unproven rumor, a dark stain on her luminous story, an eternal question without an answer. And life, as it always does, went on. Her husband, Lev Wittgenstein, eventually recovered from his grief and remarried. His second choice was another brilliant St. Petersburg beauty, Leonila Baryatinskaya. And here, as if in mockery, fate revealed its cruelest irony. Stefania, that bright comet, burned out in just 22 years. But Leonila lived an incredibly long life, leaving this world at the age of 102. The life that could have belonged to Stefania was given to another. But what is longevity compared to brilliance? The story of Stefania Radziwill is a hymn not to a long life, but to a full one. It is the tale of how, in 22 years, one can achieve more than others do in a century, find love, defend freedom, and remain forever in memory as a symbol of beauty, dignity, and a quiet, unyielding rebellion against fate.